Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
You are watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Perrier, here as always alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, good to be back with you.
It's good to be back on with you, Eugene.
Well, it's always happy to be here with all of our viewers. And of course, we've got a great show for you here today, as always. Of course, we'll be covering the ongoing issues as it concerns the genocide happening in Gaza, the potential end of the road for the Ukraine war seems to be petering out, at least from a funding perspective from the United States. So we'll talk about what the horizon holds there. Also, of course, we will be discussing some of the other issues all around the world, including, by the way, a sort of modern day convict leasing story here in the United States is sort of a major issue involving prison labor and brands you have certainly heard of. So we've got a lot here for you on the show from a number of different perspectives. So, of course, feel free to let everyone who is following you know we are here. We are live. However you want to do that, knock on a door, send a text, make a phone call, yell outside the window. Just let folks know we are here on YouTube on Breakthrough News. And of course, you are already watching us on YouTube. So just a reminder to go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Then make sure that you hit the bell after you hit the subscribe button so that you get the alerts about the things you have subscribed to. Just make your life a little bit easier, as we are always looking to do here on Breakthrough News. So hit subscribe, hit the bell, get the alerts. You'll be good to go, at least in terms of getting our content, including Dispatches with Rania Khalek. Lots of excellent interviews coming out on a regular basis. Rania, what else do you think our viewers should know?
Well, if you appreciate Breakthrough News, which I think there's no better time than a moment like now to do that, you can help support us by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Breakthrough News, where you'll get access to exclusive content, including parts of my show, Dispatches, as well as Eugene's monthly seminar on Africa, as well as really cool merch, such as... Wait for it. Hey, look at that. Look at this beautiful mug.
I brought the same color as you, though you wouldn't feel left out.
Thank you, because I get jealous. I have a jealousy problem.
I do.
I know jealousy is not healthy, but when it comes to merch that says Breakthrough News on it and I don't have it, I get very jealous. So don't be jealous like me. Become a member of Breakthrough News at patreon.com/Breakthrough News, and you can get access to our very cool merch, as well as, I think most importantly, supporting independent media. I must say, as we're dealing with this horrific genocide in Gaza, I could not be prouder for the team I get to be a part of here at Breakthrough News. I'm sure Eugene agrees with me 100%, especially the fact that we get to speak the truth about what's taking place. We don't have to sit here and pretend and self-censor, all the things that, people in the corporate media have to deal with when it comes to this issue in particular and other issues of war and imperialism. So, if you appreciate the truth, once again, support us at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Become a member. You can also do a one-time donation in the YouTube chat as you're watching live, or just on, I think, any of our videos that there's an option to donate. So all of that support is appreciated. And, I know that I think, Eugene, today's either 69 or day 70 of the genocide in Gaza. And I hope people don't start looking away. I know it can get exhausting after a war has been going on for a very, very long time. But one thing I do appreciate about the content that we've been able to offer is that we've been covering the movement that's been pushing for a ceasefire across the U.S., across the West, and including across the global South, which I feel like, we can't lose sight of the fact that this is still ongoing, and that we, like the people in Gaza, are literally depending on those of us outside to be their voices, because they've literally been cut off from the world. I think there's like a complete communications blackout right now.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, seems to happen very regularly, and obviously, the deaths, the expansion of disease, which seems to be happening quite significantly now because of the disruption in sewer services and different elements like that. The total collapse of the healthcare system. I mean, we could go on and on and on, but it's getting increasingly dire there. And in the winter months, of course, there's heavy rains on a regular basis, and now you have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people living outdoors in tents in areas that aren't really set up to address some of the issues that come in response to that. So the level of humanitarian suffering only getting more and more dire. Until a couple months ago, we said that Yemen was the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and it is very bad. So we don't want to forget that as well. But it certainly seems to have now that title unfortunately moved to Gaza. So we will have to continue to watch it, continue to talk about it, as we will here today on the freedom side. But before we get there, let's first start with the U.S. state of Alabama, where there is a very interesting lawsuit that's been filed by several unions and other community organizations against the state of Alabama and their prison labor practices. And as we turn to this story, we are very, very honored to be joined here by Eric Winston, who is a worker leader in the Union of Southern Service Workers. Eric, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's really an honor to have you here. I have to say, I mean, was quite the story when I saw that this lawsuit had come across the table. And I guess a lot of people probably have not seen this. I mean, the basics, obviously, Alabama using prisoners to work for various companies is maybe somewhat familiar. But tell us something about what the state of Alabama is doing with prisoners and how it impacts the world of low-wage work.
First, what the state of Alabama is doing, the Department of Corrections is implying slave labor, which is basically contracting out prison labor work to companies as McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, and is not they're paying them cents on the dollar for so say for instance, just to put an example, usually minimum wage is $7.25. These inmates may get 40 cent, 50 cent off the $7.25 an hour, and what that means is they don't qualify for they can't get overtime, they can't get sick leave, they can get the basic benefits that a worker is they get the basic needs that a worker has. Being a low wage worker already, we don't have many benefits or amenities anyway. So the little amenities that the worker has is stripped away because they're basically being contracted out by the Department of Corrections.
And can you explain which companies we're talking about? What kind of labor is this, and on what basis is this allowed to happen?
The Department of Corrections is in partnership with companies like KFC, McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, just to name a few in Alabama. And the way that it came to be, but this isn't just happening. This has been happening in the state of Alabama since the late 1800s, when 70% of its state income came from prison labor, and it just got amplified under this administration that Alabama has now. And that it's really it's a perfect business model if you want to take that. It's a perfect business model, but from a humanitarian issue, it's not great at all. And it's all about money, corporate greed, actually the exploitation of poor people, and that's what it was built on, and now hopefully we can bring it into that.
Your union, the Union of Southern Service Workers, has, become known, I'd say relatively well known around the country for, organizing these exact types of companies, the McDonald's, the KFCs, the Waffle Houses, and so on and so forth. So, you have, you're party to this lawsuit, you all in USSW. I mean, how are policies like what we're seeing from the state of Alabama affecting the ability of unions like yours to organize workers in these establishments?
That's a great question, and really, what it has impacted our organizing by means that it makes us go harder. It broadens our organizing efforts for mass organizing, being that low wage workers are not only on the outside, they're on the inside now, and being that all of these low wage workers have the same issues now, we bring in the light to, so how can I put this? It's making our organizer it's not making it harder, it's making it easier, because these corporations are making $billion profits off the backs of low and disenfranchised people. Now they're doing it to people who can't even fight for themselves. And that's just giving us another organizing tool in this fight to realize the voices that we have, and to give these brothers and sisters behind these walls the power to use their voice for good, not only on the inside. So when they eventually come to the outside, they have a home to come to where they can strategize to make their life better.
I think it's so incredible that you have this class action lawsuit being filed by organized labor, in addition to these, to incarcerated people. I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about the racial element here? Because obviously there's a disproportionate amount of Black people in Alabama that are being subjected to this essentially system of forced labor.
And that's a great question too. And to put this a little known fact out there, since this practice has been implemented by the Department of Corrections, for every 2 Black people that come off parole to 1 white person, they don't get paroled. Every 2 to 1. So what that means, that puts more Black and brown people back in the worker pool for these Department of Corrections, so these companies could use these employees. Well, I don't even call them employees. They're basically slaves, and that's what the model they have been using for years, denying parole of Black and brown people, so they can keep keep employing these companies through this malpractice.
I mean, really, that's an amazing fact, actually, quite in terms of the parole. Thank you for putting that out there. I mean, one of the questions I guess this just raises for me in so many different ways is, this is just speculation, but I mean, what does it say to you about these companies? I mean, they already are paying people extraordinarily low wages, and of course, they agree to set up these. They're not forced to take these workers. So, I mean, do you feel they're also complicit in this, broader situation?
Yes, and the way I personally feel about it is that they think that they can't be touched. They think that they could go by business the way it is, same old usual, and now it's coming to a head. We're getting tired of it, and we have to not only fight but organize. You only get what you organize. You only win what you organize to fight. And what these companies don't realize is that us as workers have realized the power that we have in each other, and that we're coming from these companies.
Mm.
And I don't know any other way to put it, but I'm excited, for this. This is a war going on, and we're strapping up our boots, and for my brothers and sisters in Alabama, just hold on a little bit longer, because justice is coming. Justice is coming. I can promise you.
I want to ask you, can you lay out some of the demands in the lawsuit?
I can't specifically lay out any demands in the lawsuit, but it is calling for $460 million in unpaid wages to specifically 10 still incarcerated and 10 no longer incarcerated inmates that's worked in this system for 10 years. And for the $460 billion to be paid to the inmates, and excuse me, I didn't want to say inmates, but to these employees for unpaid wages, inflation, cost of living. We're even going to like the insurance from the day they started to now, and other specifics that go into the 460 million. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. For these 20 people that filed this lawsuit, there's hundreds more coming behind that.
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see this fight. Let me just ask you this real quick before we let you go, Eric. For people who maybe are low-wage workers living in the South who see this, how can they contact the Union of Southern Service Workers?
We're on all social media platforms. We're on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Foursquare. You can reach us at www.ussw.org. Instagram, USSW, TikTok at USSW. And I encourage everybody, any low-wage workers in any state that's listening to this, to reach out, to get involved, because we can't fight this alone. We need each other.
Well, as always, really appreciate having anyone from the Union of Southern Service Workers, and in this moment, explicitly Eric Winston, joining us here on the Freedom Side. Thank you so much for your time.
I thank you so much, and I'm a big fan of you guys.
Thank you so much, brother. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
That's nice. That's nice. We're fans of his. We should have told him that before we let him go. That's a
really
it's
amazing
crazy
thing
that in 2023, 2023 America, like you still have slavery.
You really do. I mean, it really is shocking in a way. It's maybe some people would say it shouldn't be shocking, but I don't know. I don't know how else to say it. I mean, you got people. I mean, everyone I think knows there's some level of prison labor, but McDonald's, KFC, I think the city of Montgomery, all these places. And, obviously for anyone, it's to have a low wage job, there's so many difficulties, but, these people are not really given much of a choice. You don't have the opportunity to advance. As Eric was saying, you don't have overtime. You don't have any, of the major protections. You're just sort of, someone who's sent out here as a ward of the state, to collect this money. And $7.25 is already like an absurd minimum wage. But then you think people are getting paid 40 cents, I believe Eric was saying, 40 cents. I mean, what? Like this, it really is amazing. And I'm sure you probably don't know when you go to the place, they're wearing a uniform just like everyone else, but you're being served at a lot of these places by people making 40 cents. I mean, that's criminal.
Yeah, it really is incredible and criminal, as you said. And then, it's like, we should also remember, the US has, we shouldn't be surprised. I mean, this is a country that literally goes around the world and like goes to war to make sure people can't have higher wages. Yeah. So of course, this is going to be happening internally too. And then we just dress it up in some way, around, they committed a crime, so who cares? And then it's like, well, wait, what crime? And it's like, did you just criminalize being poor?
Yeah.
and Black.
Yeah. Yeah.
Welcome to America.
Basically, yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see what the progress of this is. Certainly if the parties, the 10 former and I think some current individuals incarcerated by Alabama, if they're able to prevail here, this could be huge because this has been going on for many, many years. So I'm undoubtedly Alabama, which has one of the highest incarceration rates, there must be many thousands of people out here who have been in the same situation. So in addition to those who are there now, I'm sure there are probably many people watching this very closely in the state of Alabama because they too, understand what this has been. And the irony in a way is when you come out of prison, oftentimes the only job you can get is low wage labor. So a lot of these people I'm sure are probably coming out of prison and then, obviously they're making more than 40 cents, but then the only thing they can do is also a poverty wage. So it's sort of the poverty wage to poverty wage pipeline we see here in the state of Alabama. But yeah, definitely very, very interesting effort. And I definitely encourage people to follow Union of Southern Service Workers for more on this and a number of other interesting fights, Waffle House, Family Dollar, many different places all across the South. But on that note, we are going to turn the page to some of the more controversial issues as it concerns how the issue of what's been happening vis-a-vis Palestinian struggle for liberation in the past couple months has affected the conversation about who to support, how to support them, what's right, what's wrong, and how that all looks. And for that conversation, we are very happy to be joined here by the editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News, Ben Becker, who is partially joining us for other reasons because he recently wrote an article called Building a Real Left, Not One That Condemns Resistance and Is Without Palestinians, which you can find on liberationnews.org. Dr. Ben Becker, thank you for joining us here on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, very good to have you here. I guess my first question I'll always ask, I read the title, Building a Real Left, Not One That Condemns Resistance and Is Without Palestinians. What led you to write this article?
Yeah, well, I think that in a way we've been in a moment where we've seen mass unity on the left. And the last month and a half in particular, where we've seen people in the streets almost every single night. And I think, that's been amazing. I've been part of that. Many others I know who watch the show and organize have been part of that, seen this truly mass anti-war movement that's growing really in defense of the Palestinian people when it's so obvious that who the occupier is, who the aggressor is, that who the colonizer is, sort of the moral clarity has been there in these last 6 weeks, especially of bombardment, siege, genocide. But that does not mean we should forget that there was an initial period of, I would say, considerable confusion, even among people who are leftists, progressives, who theoretically and abstractly stand with Palestine in all times, especially right after October 7th, where there was sort of this thing where people were putting an equal sign between the two sides, condemning both sides, saying they support sort of the Palestinian right to resist in general. But then when it has any concreteness, they were running away from it very quickly. In particular, Naomi Klein, Michelle Goldberg, some of the leading sort of lights of left liberal politics, I would say more liberal than left. And it's not just a matter of setting the historical record straight, which I think has value in and of itself as a historian, but also I think because we could be entering a new phase of the Palestinian struggle where it's not just about one side being on the receiving end of bombs, but this could actually intensify into a more regular and intense war in which there are counteroffensive, in which other countries in the region, not to mention the Palestinians, are striking back at Israel. There could be more fighting in the West Bank. There could be more fighting in 48. And if that happens, we don't want to return to that moment of confusion where everyone runs away and says, well, all sides are bad and this is a complicated thing, and I'll stand with Palestinians only if they are committed to civil disobedience that's nonviolent, which, of course, the Palestinian people, and this is what my article goes through, have a long tradition of trying many different tactics. It's not like the October 7th was the first attempt to sort of strike back at the colonial occupation. When they went in the Great March of Return, nonviolently, they were shot down. So the people who came on October 7th really returned to the same places where their nonviolent protests of the Palestinian people had been repressed, and this time they came with arms. So I think it's important to review some of the history that we've just been through the last 2 months, because the next few months or years could be a phase of actually more intense war.
I refer to a poll here to not just back up what you're saying, but then to get your response. There's this poll by a very well-known and highly respected polling outfit. It's called the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. And it conducted this poll during the week-long pause back in early December in Gaza, Jerusalem, and the West Bank. So it's not all Palestinians, but it's a pretty good I guess thermometer is the right word of general Palestinian opinion in these places. And the majority of respondents, 81%, said they believe Hamas's attack on the October 7th was a response to longstanding Israeli attacks on Palestinians and their holy places and aimed at releasing prisoners. More importantly, the majority, 72%, believed the decision to launch the attack was the right one despite the costs. And that's actually that goes up to 82% in Gaza and then 82% in the West Bank and 57% in Gaza. Popularity of Hamas has gone up with 72% saying they're satisfied with the role of Hamas right now. And then 11% saying they're satisfied with Mahmoud Abbas, who the Palestinian Authority leader that the U.S. is supporting and also trying to give control of Gaza to. But anyway, sorry, I won't ramble on too long here. I just want to get to something very, very important, which is when we're talking about the issue of Palestinians and what to support and who to support. The number supporting armed struggle in the West Bank is 68%, which has doubled in the last 2 years. And then 69% overall support a return to armed confrontations, which is up 11% from September. So, I'm just curious, Ben, after hearing some of those numbers, how do we take those numbers and understand them in the context of how we are supposed to be talking about Palestine on the left, given the sort of wishy-washy stuff we saw after October 7th?
Yeah, I think these are crucial poll numbers that everyone should familiarize themselves and in a way memorize. It doesn't mean that we from outside have to say, well, if I were Palestinian, how I would have responded to each one of those poll questions. You're not obligated to support this or that party or this or that tactic inside of Palestine from the outside. But you are obligated to grapple with those numbers. You are obligated, actually, if you're a serious activist, to try to get to that question. Why is it that the support for armed struggle has gone up it's doubled in the last couple of years? Why did that happen? That's not because Palestinians are prone to violence and, just love the gun and have a, sort of a romantic view of it. These are people who have lived through the worst forms of occupation, expulsion, displacement, and genocide, and have seen that only intensify. They've seen Israeli politics move further to the right. They've seen the international community and all the sort of treaties and promises of all these types of solutions all fall by the wayside. That's why people have arrived at this. And those numbers about support for Hamas on October 7th, that, again, is not that Hamas has not always been as popular as it is right now. So we have to grapple with that. If we're serious about building a left that involves the people who are under the gun, the people who are under occupation, we have to really understand the sentiments that are driving that community. And that's why if you get up and you condemn the resistance, you condemn all the things that 70 to 80 to 90% of people are supporting, you're going to build basically a left of the West that doesn't include the Muslim and Arab community in particular, but also other colonized peoples, nationally oppressed peoples in the United States and around the world. This is the sentiment that's been growing in the global South as a whole. So the question is the left in the United States trying to build sort of a abstract and pure, politics around basically saying, well, we're against occupation in the abstract, or are we trying to actually unite with the social force, a huge section of humanity that's rising up right now? And of course, some people say, well, you can't build respectability if you in the United States or Western politics, if you speak like this. But the question is always respectability among whom? I'm for being respectable. I want our politics to be respected. But are we trying to get respectability among a tiny section of the ruling class of this country, the liberal section of the ruling class, which of course is against Palestinian liberation, no matter what tactics they take, has never put any skin in the game in defense of Palestine. In fact, has always formed a kind of like left-wing cover for Israel? Or are we trying to build respect among the broad working class of this country and of the global South? So yeah, like I think that's our true audience. And that was really the point of this article I was writing. And it's something that's actually recurred in many different struggles back to Vietnam, even before Vietnam. Like, are we just for peace in the abstract, or do we actually believe that the Vietnamese people, have a right to their own homeland? So in the anti-war movement in the 1960s and 70s, this was a big debate inside the movement. Are we just for peace, or actually are we saying that the U.S. has no right to be there and that this is Vietnamese land? So actually, victory to the National Liberation Front, that became a big slogan on the left and was part of the radicalization of the 1960s and 1970s of U.S. youth. And I think a similar thing could be happening right now with this Palestine struggle.
No, I think those are all very important points and crucial to understanding this. And I mean, it also, I think, speaks in terms of an orientation perspective, at least from the United States, like, who is the onus on? I mean, to maybe just sort of pick up on your historical example, this is actually something that was once posed to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. about the issue of Vietnam. And people say, well, how can you support the National Liberation Front and the South Vietnamese because they're committing all these atrocities? And, they're committing all these atrocities. And, then as now, a lot of those atrocities were not real, but, it's war. I'm sure things are happening. But his response was, this is not random, that this is in fact only happening because the United States is preventing the Vietnam from emerging from colonization. So what's the point of sort of empty denunciations if you don't actually address the cause of what's actually taking place, and that is the U.S. occupation, and thus the U.S. war in that sense. And so I am going to oppose the U.S. war in Vietnam, which is the best way to actually bring peace and justice to the area. So in a way, also raising the issue that, is it also the job of people in the United States to just be, constantly telling other people what to do, as opposed to looking more specifically at the role the country they have the most influence in is playing in the conflict?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is really a U.S.-Israeli war. I mean, that we should always keep saying that Israel would not be able to do this at all were it not for the U.S. support. The last few days, Biden has been trying to put distance between himself and Netanyahu. He's trying in a way to throw Netanyahu under the bus in certain aspects of the far-right government. He understands how his support for the Israeli genocide of the Palestinian people is probably going to tank his 2024 election. So he's trying to create a narrative. So for the next 9-10 months, he can say, well, I was always trying to minimize civilian casualties. I think it's far too late for that. I don't think anyone's going to buy it, but it's what he's trying to do. And I think it's very important we not let him get away with that, and consistently emphasize that if it were not for the U.S. support for this war and support for Israel, really the occupation as a whole would collapse. And, it doesn't, we're not saying that, again, if you were Palestinian, how you would have to vote in the West Bank or Gaza Strip. But we should point out this particular fact, that Hamas is obviously among the most popular party right now. Marwan Barghouti, who's from Fatah, is imprisoned in Israel. He actually is the most prominent and most popular political figure in Palestine. The Palestinian factions across the ideological spectrum have been trying to reform a national front. That's what's different from the Vietnam era, where you had the National Liberation Front, which obviously represented all the national liberation forces. There's been a conscious effort from the U.S. and from Israel to keep the Palestinian people divided, keep the Palestinian factions divided. And is it our place in the United States to pick and choose which Palestinian group is valid, which one is credible, which one needs to leave the country? That's the new thing. How are we going to get Hamas to leave Gaza? How is that the U.S.'s role? I mean, that's worse than the world policeman. You're actually going to try to displace the most popular party in a area and try to make it leave the whole country. I mean, what gives the U.S. the right to do that? Imagine if another country were to say, well, given the threat that Joe Biden has posed to the whole world, or Donald Trump or Barack Obama has posed, we actually think the Democratic Party would has to relocate its entire leadership to a different country. I mean, when you actually put the shoe on the other foot, the absurdity becomes so clear. But this is the kind of anti-imperialist consciousness that we need to be hammering away at right now. People are open to it. People are fed up. People are tired with Biden and Trump together. If there was ever a time to build independent, left-wing, socialist, anti-imperialist politics, now's the time.
Ben, I want to ask you, you mentioned before other players in the region, and there's a very real chance, though it's still less likely, it could happen that this war could spread further. I mean, it is involving, right now, there's so many fronts. The main front is obviously Gaza, Palestine. That's like where the primary problem is, the primary fighting is. But you also have Lebanon, you also have Yemen, you also have the Iraqis. This is a regional issue because Israel is a problem for the region. So going back to your original point, I guess what I'm trying to ask here is how would you, I guess I'm a bit worried. Being in Lebanon, I'm a bit worried. Like, if the front in Lebanon explodes and it opens across the country, okay, it's not Palestine anymore. It's not Hamas anymore. Now you have Hezbollah. Is it going to be denunciations of Hezbollah and condemning Lebanon? What about Yemen? You know what I mean? Like, it's like none of these groups, I think everything you're saying applies to these groups, but I just like to get your perspective on how the response should be as this war escalates and spreads and has all these different fronts.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that there would be a lot of confusion in the US and Western left generally among certain elements of it. And by this, I really mean, again, sort of the liberal, I feel uneasy about even sometimes calling them left. It's really people who sort of take their lead from the liberal section of the ruling class. And so they're only willing to go basically as far as they're willing to go. We've seen this over and over. In the US, I was an organizer with the Answer Coalition against the US invasion of Iraq. And there was a section of the peace movement that wanted to just say, US out of Iraq, which was good. We agreed with that. That was our main slogan. But should we bring the Palestinian issue into this? And even though the activists themselves said, well, we support Palestine, the main thing is in Congress, up on Capitol Hill, no one's for Palestine. So if we bring up Palestine, we're going to lose some anti-war voices in Congress. And that's the most important thing. So again, they were orienting in that direction. So I think if the war were to expand even further, you'd have a lot of arguments using the same logic, where people would say, well, we're for peace. Yes, we would obviously be for peace too, peace in the Middle East. But we wouldn't join, our section of the movement would not join in the demonization of any of the countries or parties or movements that you mentioned. Because again, what they represent are authentic. They're not the only authentic, but they are an authentic representation of the political will of the people of those countries. And in this context, against Israel would really mean against US imperialism. So this would be, in fact, a wider national liberation struggle. And it wouldn't be sufficient to just say you're for peace, because peace on whose terms? Like we always say it, we want peace with justice. And I think the big threat with this, the reason why they don't want this war to expand is because it will utterly expose which governments and which regimes and states in the region are fully in the tank with the US and which ones are representing the will of the people. Because obviously the will of the people across the Arab world, the Middle East, West Asia, is with the Palestinian people. Hundreds of millions of people have no confusion about that. So if there were a wider war, I think, as you can see already, the support for Yemen goes way up because of what they've been doing. Whether or not you like it in the United States, if you're an activist, you have to know that tens of millions of people are cheering Yemen when they say they're going to have a military blockade of Israeli ships, right? And so again, it will pose the question even more sharply if there's a sort of a larger U.S.-Israeli Western war against what they're calling, what could be called the resistance axis. We can't be neutral in that. We have to say that one side represents basically the colonized people trying to overthrow now centuries of colonization and national oppression. And it would be to the advantage of justice around the whole world for U.S. imperialism to actually lose the war in the Middle East, for all U.S. troops to leave the Middle East, all the U.S. bases in the Middle East to be closed down. And we could take all those trillions of dollars that have been spent on pointless, needless wars that the peoples of those regions will never accept, and we can use that for infrastructure, for jobs, for education, for housing. Here in New York, we had a building collapse just a few days ago because the infrastructure is crumbling. So we have a whole country and a whole economy that's geared towards a war economy. It can be geared towards a peace economy. So we're going to have many different slogans if the war expands, but a key one, of course, will be we need money for jobs and education, not for war and occupation.
Very succinct, very well put. Dr. Ben Becker, editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News. Pretty good outlet, if you ask me. Thank you so much, as always, for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much. Great show.
Well, Ben's got me fired up now.
Well, perfect. Well, then why don't we just go right into our next guest, who I think will appreciate you being fired up. That is Leanne Foulahan, who's the education director at the People's Forum, an editor at 1804 Books, and an organizer with the Shut It Down for Palestine Coalition, joining us once again to check in on the global uprising for Gaza and Palestine. Leanne, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thanks for having me. Always great to be here.
Well, pleasure is all ours. And let me start here. I woke up this morning and I was greeted by an interesting headline in Politico. Vice President Kamala Harris urges White House. I don't even remember the rest of it, but it was like basically how Kamala Harris is urging Joe Biden to speak more compassionately about Palestinians. But it's obvious that there's a lot of leaking going on in Washington, D.C. to the media by the Biden administration and individuals in the Biden administration to try to make it seem as if they're not really on the same page with Benjamin Netanyahu and the entire Israeli leadership vis-a-vis the genocide of Gaza. I wonder how you evaluate both the obvious reasons why they want to distance themselves, which is anger in the United States, but also how you evaluate their actual complicity despite their words.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that these the tone switch over the past couple of days, the attempt, like you said, to distance themselves from Netanyahu is really just exposing that they're having a PR crisis right now. The State Department went over the heads of Congress essentially and approved more millions of dollars of military aid over to Israel. The complicity is still very much concrete. It's still very much there. They're still very much backing this genocidal assault on the Palestinian people, but they really are very uncomfortable with the isolation on both the world stage and domestically that it's bringing about. So I think that what we're seeing is an attempt to say, hey, we're not fully backing this. Hey, we did say to be careful about civilians. It's not changing, in a sense, the material basis for that support and that complicitness. And in fact, we can't deny the major role the United States has played in orchestrating this genocidal assault. It doesn't change that at all. I think this is an attempt to sort of appease the discontent, the dissent, the uprisings that they have on their hands. Just yesterday, staffers of the White House staged a protest in front of the White House. Biden's own staffers said, we don't approve of what you've been doing. We want a ceasefire. It's been echoed by the millions over the past 2 months across the country. Actions are only becoming more frequent, and people are actually gaining the skills to be doing these actions. And people are becoming better organizers. They're happening more quickly. So I think that Biden and his administration, including Kamala Harris, are in a very uncomfortable position. They don't want to be uncomfortable. They would like to continue going on as usual, supporting Israel the way they've been supporting Israel, but they basically Netanyahu has backed them into a corner, and they don't have an exit strategy right now. So these I see as attempts to try to convince the general public that there's some sort of moral standing that the White House has right now, but it doesn't seem that people are really being convinced.
Well, looks like we might have lost Rania here, but I will ask you another question I have here. Let me pull this up, though, because I want to get this right, Leanne, but it's just interesting polling that sort of speaks to this very issue. The most recent Economist YouGov poll asked people, do they want to increase, decrease, or maintain the same military aid to Israel? And the plurality is for decreasing military aid to Israel. Now, I have to say, even I was surprised about that. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of opposition, but maybe there was some other time in the past this was true, but it seems almost unprecedented to have a plurality of people in the United States of America saying send less military aid to Israel. And of the clear majority, it's either send less or keep it the same. I mean, so it does feel that we're seeing something of a change. I don't want to say a sea change, but something of a change towards how this issue is seen by the majority of Americans.
I totally agree. I think this is unprecedented. And it's exposing something about the way the system works that is going to be very difficult for the general public to forget. We have, on the one hand, bipartisan support for Israel. There's very little calls, both on either side of the major parties, for any sort of concrete change in U.S. support for Israel. But we also now are seeing bipartisan, I want to say beyond bipartisan, we're seeing broad support for an end to this kind of support, a ceasefire. We're seeing broad calls on across the political spectrum for an end, in particular right now, and I think we should be clear about that, in particular right now for an end to U.S. support for the genocidal war right now. This, in a sense, is outlining the completely different interests that the White House has, no matter which party they're in, with the interests of the general public. And it's very demonstrative. And I think that for this to be happening around the issue of Palestine is unprecedented. I also think it is unprecedented, the level of violence that the Israeli state, it's not unprecedented, the level of violence that the Israeli state is committing against the Palestinian people, but the scale, the shock that it's producing on the world stage, the massive massacring of Palestinian people, children, families, essential infrastructure, you cannot deny the impact that has on the human consciousness. And when you have a political class that is serving only profit and imperial agendas, and then you have people who are trying to see the world and understand it, and are trying to make their own decisions about what's right and wrong, you're going to see that those interests are fundamentally different. And I think that's what's being demonstrated right now.
You know, one other thing I just want to check in on, and I think that is real, is obviously these things, so much of what's happening in terms of public opinion is being driven by the horrible images we're seeing, but a lot of it is being driven by the activism that has been happening on the ground that has been bringing the issue, right in front of people's faces constantly every single day. I mean, where are we now? I mean, I think obviously we've seen many, many weeks, but are we seeing a continuation of this momentum?
Definitely. So we've been seeing an escalation, an intensification of the number, the type, the level of participation in mass mobilizations. And we need to really recognize the fact that participating in these kinds of mass mobilizations is in itself educational. People are transformed by participating in this. It's something that we've talked about before on the show, that we hoped that the call to shut it down it's a diffuse call, but one with very clear objectives. We do want people to understand the way in which U.S. society is backing fully the Zionist regime and the colonial project in Israel. And people are going to be making lots of connections. They suddenly become committed now to the Palestinian cause beyond, in many cases, beyond just calling for a ceasefire. And so in the past week alone, I can't actually tell you the number of different actions that were taken in New York City alone, where I'm based. We had after the global strike that was called by many different sectors of Palestinian society, and that was the response was in fact quite global. There was a day of multiple actions in New York City. We had a large volunteer meeting where there were almost 400 people. I actually can't count them all, who were present in person, asking what can we do next. And as a result, in every neighborhood of New York City, there has been a speak out, a moment where people come together. They are organized, they are unorganized, they know each other, they don't know each other, but they're coming together for this common cause, and they're educating on street corners. That can't be overestimated, the impact of this. And it's the first time in a long time that people are not only committing to coming out and being on the streets, but they're committing to educating their community. And that's having a huge impact. We're seeing this in many different manifestations across the United States, where it's extremely significant. The population in the United States has been subjected to a propaganda campaign over the past decades that makes it very difficult to even have any idea of what's going on in Palestine that's based in reality, that's based in some sort of objective truth. And despite that, it's been shattered in only a few days. And people are taking on not only the role of, declaring what side they're on, but of bringing this information to other people in their areas. So I think that what we're seeing is a continuous building of momentum. The slowdown that I think the White House hoped for and banked on around the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays is not happening. The cold weather is going on as usual, but people are still out. They are showing the images now, but we were in front of the New York Times in some bitter cold on Monday morning and stayed out there for a couple of hours with high energy. This is something that people really are very passionate about. They are very committed to, and it will be very interesting to see how this develops further. There certainly is no going back. This change is dramatic, it's significant, and it's going to have major implications for the way the White House is able to convince its own population of its policies.
You know, Leanne, there's two important figures, though I would say one is more important than the other in this case, that have actually mentioned these protests. One was the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, in the last speech he gave about a month ago now, maybe even a little bit more than a month ago. I've lost track of time. He specifically mentioned the protests in the West and how crucial they are to pushing for a ceasefire. It's almost like the protests in the West, I would say all around the world, but in the West specifically, in the U.S. specifically, because this is America's war, really, the U.S. can stop it tomorrow. Those protests are so crucial because it's in the belly of the beast. And then you also have, I think, much less important figure, but he's a figure nonetheless, Benjamin Netanyahu. But I'm just going to quote him. This was last week in the Financial Times. Benjamin Netanyahu, I'm just reading directly from it. Benjamin Netanyahu, at least in private, has been blunt about what Israel needs most to destroy Hamas: a steady supply of more U.S. bombs. Quote, "We need three things from the U.S. munitions, munitions, and munitions," the Israeli prime minister told a group of local government officials, according to a recording obtained by the Israel Today newspaper. "There are huge demonstrations in Western capitals," added Netanyahu, who is concerned political pressure overseas might threaten the U.S. arms shipments. "We need to apply counter pressure. There have been disagreements with the best of our friends." I think that is so important that the leader of the country carrying out this genocide is concerned about these protests. And, I couldn't help but notice that he also mentioned we need countermeasures. So, like, being involved in organizing these, what do those countermeasures look like? I know we kind of talked about them the last time I had you on, but can you lay them out? And it doesn't seem like they're working.
Yeah, it does not actually seem like they're working. I think the strength of the popular momentum for this is really much stronger than the propaganda campaign coming from any Zionist institutions. There have been attempts since this latest wave, this latest surge in solidarity for Palestine, in the movement for solidarity for Palestine, to use scare tactics and other forms of repression fully announced by and backed by the state at all levels, to try to convince people that to come out for Palestine, to speak for Palestine, to organize and execute actions for the Palestine Solidarity Movement would in fact make you a terrorist, and that you need to be careful, you need to protect yourself. We saw many people getting fired from their jobs, many students are getting suspended or becoming under disciplinary investigations. We saw last week now, time is somewhat of a blur, but Congress kind of called this ridiculous circus of a hearing where they brought in very pro-Zionist university presidents and accused them of not being Zionist enough. And it was kind of like a very bizarre performance to try to put more pressure on their supposed allies to do better, because basically they're failing at repressing, in this case, the student movement, but I think overall, the general movement for Palestine. This billions of dollars in the propaganda machine for Israel is basically in a corner on the defensive. We have not been able to see any strong organized force coming out for Israel at all in the past couple of weeks, past 2 months, in the United States at least. So I think that this is, this is a frustration that Netanyahu has definitely expressed, and we take that quote as a victory. I mean, if he's feeling the heat, that means Biden is feeling the heat, and we know he is, that these mass mobilizations are having a very significant effect on what these heads of state feel that they can and cannot do. So for Netanyahu to not only admit that these are working and call for stronger forces to try to stop them, one puts us on alert. We need to be very careful. We need to maintain we may maintain and build the momentum, which everyone is committed to doing. But two, should give a sense of accomplishment to everybody who has contributed to this growing movement for Palestine. It is certainly not insignificant. That Netanyahu has said this. It's definitely not insignificant that Biden is very vocally trying to walk back his deep friendship with Netanyahu. He's, trying to disassociate himself from him. This is really a result of pressure from below.
Mm-hmm. Leanne Fulahan, organizer with the Shut It Down for Palestine Coalition. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for having me, and hopefully we see everyone at the next Shut It Down Day on December 16th.
Indeed. Well, Rania, please, anything you want to say there?
I'm in awe of the fact that people have kept it up and the people are still organizing for Palestine. I mean, it's so incredibly important. Like this has been going on again, 70 days, 70 days of genocide. And Israel was banking on everybody just getting used to it and being like, okay, like it was bad at first, but now it's just normal. And okay, Gaza's being genocided. I've moved on. But that hasn't happened. And it's a testament to the fact that this issue, the issue of the struggle for justice in Palestine, is so powerful around the world. And it means so much because everybody can connect to it. Everybody can relate to it in some way. And anybody who hasn't completely lost their humanity is able to feel empathy and to want to hit back. And also it's like an interesting moment because, people, I think, Eugene, people kind of forgot about Palestine a little bit. Like even in the region, like a lot of people I know who really care about Palestine, it's like, okay, but it's, settler colonialism and we lost. It's over. Yeah. It's not over anymore. And people are talking about it. Palestine hasn't been forgotten. And I think the world has actually changed in a significant, cataclysmic kind of way because of October 7th and the ongoing genocide after it. So that's all I have to say.
Well taken. We are going to move the show forward here. As always, we are very honored to be joined for this next segment by Vijay Prashad, who, among many other superlatives, is the executive director of the indispensable Tricontinental Institute. Vijay, thank you so much for being back with us.
And nice to be with you. Thanks a lot.
Well, I want to get to some of your thoughts about some of the things happening in Palestine, but I want to start in a different place. You've got the United States and the European Union trying to tee up $110 billion for Ukraine here at the end of the year, a little Christmas gift for Mr. Zelensky. They may not succeed, but in the face of almost every single person, even many people who are pro-Ukraine, saying the war is completely stalled and Ukraine can never win. I mean, what does it say that the United States and the European governments are still trying to pour in $110 billion?
Well, look, frankly, that war, that conflict has been going on now for so long. And with all the money and ammunition provided by the West to Ukraine, Ukraine has not been able to make advances into the Donbass region. It hasn't been able to push Russian forces back from the Crimea back to Russian borders. I mean, the fact of the matter is Russian troops entered that region to create a land bridge to Crimea. Russian forces entered that region to conduct some sort of political unification with the Donbass. That's about all that the Russians seem to be interested in. There wasn't really an interest in bombing Kiev. Mr. Zelensky went to the Argentinian president's inauguration. He then came to Washington, met not only Mr. Biden and congressional figures, but he also spent an afternoon hanging out with arms company executives. Well, how did Mr. Zelensky get to these places? He flew out of Kiev airport. And that is not an insignificant thing to say because, the way in which, for instance, the United States conducted its wars in Libya, in Afghanistan, Iraq, first thing you do is take out all the airports. Russians haven't done that. That's because it seems to me that it's not in their interest to conduct a war that is about annexing all of Ukraine. They had limited war aims. And in fact, if you judge them by their war aims, which is to hold the Donbass, hold the land bridge through Mariupol to Crimea, the Ukrainians haven't been able to push them out from that territory. In that sense, Russia has really got what it wanted and is not being ejected from there. So this is a strategic defeat for the Ukrainians. And that's the reason why many people around the world are saying, look, there needs to be a peace agreement. Forget the US Republican Party. That's just one phalanx of the right wing in the United States. Their hesitation about funding Ukraine has got to do with their own narrow political fantasy about building a giant wall on the US Mexico border. They're not serious people. I don't take them seriously. More serious is the opposition growing in Europe, where there seems to be great sense of even dismay at the continuation of that war, which is why the European Union is expediting Ukraine's entry into the EU. They were even willing to pay the Hungarian government led by Viktor Orban what should effectively be called a bribe, so that Hungary no longer blackballs the ability of Ukraine from entering the European Union. Now with Donald Tusk back in power in Poland, there's another pro-Western guy in Eastern Europe. So Ukraine, I think, being brought into the European Union is not so much about the European Union and Ukraine. I think it's a lot about quelling the sense of dismay inside Europe, which is saying, hey, listen, we can't keep supporting the Ukrainians. In Germany, the far right and others gaining on some of these issues, making the center afraid. So I think that war, substantially, the Russians have got what they wanted. They are not being pushed back. A peace deal, I suppose, would be in order, but the West is never going to allow it, because as Lloyd Austin said in Kiev, the point of Western support for this is not to save the Ukrainians, it's to weaken Russia. It's just not happened.
Well, you're always talking about, Vijay, the battle of ideas. And in a post-October 7 world where there seems to be a reshuffle of what's important, where the U.S. wants to be, before it was all Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. And then West Africa was, on fire in a good way. And then you had, I don't even know what else happened this year. But now it's like, it's just been Gaza, 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 Gaza. And the world kind of like looking at the world through the lens of Gaza. And so I'm curious, in a post-October 7 world where the U.S. is trying to support Israel's genocide in Gaza while also still sending weapons to Ukraine, while also trying to maintain its great power competition with China, and also trying to maintain control of Latin America, maintain control of Africa, it just seems so overstretched. And Israel is like basically showing the world exactly what it's always been. Where are we at in the battle of ideas?
Well, let's go back to the question of Israel, just to sharpen the point a little bit. It's very clear. Everybody now knows 18,000 civilians killed. I think what needs to be understood is 1,550 Palestinian families have lost multiple members. 320 Palestinian families. By the way, this number might seem small to people, but I want you to think about this. I'm not talking about individuals. I'm talking about families. And if you know the Palestinian family, it's about 10 people in a family, which is why 320 families in Gaza have lost more than 10 people. I mean, what the Israelis are conducting in Gaza, the aggregate number 18,000 tells you a lot. You understand? But the 320 families have lost more than 10 people. You can get the gravity of how the war is prosecuted. They are bombing entire buildings, bombing family homes, bombing neighborhoods, wiping out families. This is creating a kind of sociocide. Okay, the word we are using is genocide, but also Palestinian society is going to not be able to recover so easily. After the previous bombings of Gaza, 1,000 people dead, 1,500 people dead. Now, just these 320 families have lost cumulatively almost 4,000 people. Just these 320 families. That's 4 times the death toll from Operation Permanent Resolve. Just to put it in perspective, this is sociocide at a different level. Palestinian society is being attacked in order for the Israelis to conduct what, you got to understand as a permanent Nakba since 1948, what Israeli officials have called directly the Gaza Nakba. What I want to say about the broader question of the battle of ideas is between the conflict in Ukraine and this sociocidal, genocidal war in Gaza, between these two, there are a lot of clarities emerging for people, particularly in the global north. These clarities had been there before in the south. In fact, when the Ukraine conflict started, at that time, many leaders of the global south came out and said, we don't need to either support Russia or support the West. This is not our war. We have other conflicts. Why aren't you talking about our conflicts? Prime Minister of Namibia made this point directly at the Munich Security Summit. But now, even in the global north, there is a kind of clarity. Look at the reaction to the conflict in Ukraine and look at the poor reaction in the north to the conflict in Gaza. I must say, though, that at the same time, the inability of the Israelis with all this force to stop Hamas and other factions from responding is incredible. I mean, yesterday, 10 Israeli soldiers were killed. Yesterday, the United States informed the Lebanese government that Hezbollah must pull back from the dividing line that is there between Lebanon and Israel, to so-called come to Resolution 1701, UN Resolution 1701. Why? Because, in fact, the Israelis, despite this barrage backed by the United States, now slightly trying to temper that, despite all that, Hezbollah is still at the border, still contesting with the Israelis, and Hamas and others are still firing and killing, yesterday, 10 soldiers. So, this is a revelatory thing that these powers, whether it's the United States or Israel, they don't have the open field. There is indeed a major sense of weakness, and this has created clarities not only in the global south, but certainly in the global north.
Well, one of the things, Vijay, that people are asking, and this is maybe a bridging issue between Ukraine and Palestine too, is will the Israelis be held accountable in front of the International Criminal Court, which, of course, when it comes to Ukraine, is willing to issue any indictment anytime. When it comes to Africa, will indict everyone in every orientation. But when it comes to Palestine, you had the head of the court, just sort of driving around Israel saying, I'm not here to investigate anything, just to sensitize people or whatever it was he said. So I guess the question I want to ask you to speak to is, one, is there value in the calls that people are making for the International Criminal Court to do something here? And two, how do you evaluate the reticence of the court to make any sort of representation on this issue that bears resemblance to previous situations they've intervened in?
Well, the first thing to remember is the Rome Statute, which is the treaty that produces the International Criminal Court, was, it was negotiated in good faith by the tens, hundreds of countries, 180 some countries that negotiated the Rome Statute. It came into effect in 2002. The very next year, the United States conducted an illegal war against Iraq. Nobody in the US administration, despite the fact that UN Secretary General Kofi Annan called it in public an illegal war, not one high official of the United States was indicted. There was no investigation brought before the International Criminal Court. Now, later in its history, prosecutor Fateh Bensouda several times said she wanted to open a file on the US war on Iraq, US war on Afghanistan, and the Israeli bombings of Gaza, several times. In fact, every time Ms. Bensouda opened a file, the US put immense pressure on her personally. What do I mean personally? John Bolton, National Security Advisor to the US government, in fact, publicly said that if Ms. Bensouda opens a file on the United States, the US government will never allow any of her family members to get a visa to come to the US. And in fact, if she needed to come and talk at the UN Security Council, they may not allow her to come. Imagine that kind of direct mafia-like pressure against the family of Fateh Bensouda. I mean, what do they have to do with her decisions at the court? Well, the current senior prosecutor, Karim Khan King's counsel, mind you, a British national, is a very conservative man. I mean, he comes from the Tory tradition in the UK. This is not even a Labour Party fellow. Karim Khan KC, in fact, came to the Rafah crossing early part of the war. He made some good statements saying aid needs to get through and so on. Let's not erase that from the record. Then he went on his little tour of Israel. Now, interestingly, let's go back to the start of the conflict in Ukraine. Weeks into the start of the conflict in Ukraine, pressure began to build up saying Mr. Putin and a member of his cabinet had moved Ukrainian children into Russia for safety. And then a warrant was put out in their names, calling them war criminals, saying they had conducted a war crime, which is transfer of population, in this case, children. And therefore, when Mr. Putin was to go for the BRICS meeting in Johannesburg, a lot of pressure for him not to go. He didn't go in the end. Sergei Lavrov went in his place. Imagine, they moved children from an active war zone. That earned Mr. Putin a warrant from that same court, the International Criminal Court. Now, Mr. Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, other high officials of the Israeli government have directly been responsible for the murder of over 7,000 Palestinian children. Murder, not transfer of population. Murder of 7,000 children. They have been responsible for wiping out effectively 320 families. Not even an investigation from the International Criminal Court. Now, but I still think, Eugene, going to your question, I still think it's important for people to bang on the door of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Why? Because the International Criminal Court is a court produced by an internationally negotiated treaty, the Rome Statute. We must demand the right for the Rome Statute to be enacted. Mr. Karim Khan KC is not a king. He's not like some, nobleman who makes his own decisions. They must be held accountable to world opinion. We must continue to bang at their door.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Rania.
No. Go ahead.
I was just going to say
could do this all
briefly.
day.
I was just going to say briefly, Vijay, since Rania did bring up the Battle of Ideas, you're also with Leftward Books. You guys have just put out a new piece, Decolonizing the Palestinian Mind. I was hoping you could just talk about that book a little bit as well.
It's interesting. Haider Eid is a professor of literature at Gaza University. About a year and a half, 2 years ago, Haider sent me his manuscript saying, look, I'm having a hard time getting this book published. Will you guys do it? You guys seem to not be afraid of the backlash from all sides. And, Haider Eid is a very important and important voice, not only from Gaza, but of Palestine, very critical of Oslo, coming out of the tradition of Edward Said's statement that the Oslo Accord was a Palestinian Versailles, a surrender to the Israelis. He comes out of that tradition. He sent me a book which was incredible. It was basically making an argument to go beyond the Oslo Accords. Well, I was like, this conflict has heated up. And Haider sent voice notes saying that, he was trapped in Gaza, 2 young daughters, family, scared. Eventually, they moved slightly south. As the Israelis kept lying to the Palestinians, telling them, go along Salahuddin Street, go to Khan Yunis, go to Rafah. Every time Palestinians, and 85% of Gaza has been displaced, by the way, every time Palestinians moved further south on Salahuddin Street, the Israelis followed and bombed and are now telling them to go to this tiny enclave, an old Palestinian Bedouin village on the edge of the Mediterranean. So while he was being chased out towards Rafah, he sent me audio notes, which we made into the preface to the book. It's a very beautiful opening of the book. He talks about standing aloft and looking at all of Gaza. It's a very moving book. The book itself is tremendous, and I'm very proud that we, Leftward Books, far away in Delhi, were given, he trusted us this Palestinian writer for us to be the publisher. Fortunately, Haider Eid and his family were able to leave Gaza because he's a dual national, also a South African national. And I got to commend the South African government, because the South African government went all out to get their nationals out of Gaza and bring them to South Africa. The South African government also, by the way, has been out there, calling for an ICC investigation, calling this genocide and so on. And therefore, Heather is in South Africa. We're going to do a lot of events about that book, Eugene, and I very much hope people will go to leftward.com and be able to have a look at it.
Well, I hope they can as well. It looks like a fantastic book. I've never been let down by anything from Leftward Books, and I know I won't be this time. Vijay Prashad, Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute, thank you so much for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks a lot, guys. Take care of yourself.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
BJ is just the best.
Agreed.
Absolutely
agreed.
I know we have a bit of time to chat before we wrap up here, Eugene.
It looks like you got something to say. I'm ready.
I do have something to say. I'm going to start you off. I'm going to get you wound up because I want you to go on a rant. I was chatting with a friend earlier today, and we were talking about, I was asking, I was like, why doesn't Israel just understand, like, if they want Hezbollah to stop firing at them, just stop your war in Gaza? And because then they can, the Hezbollah will stop firing if you stop the war in Gaza, and then your settlers can go back to their homes, right? Because that's what they keep complaining about with the North. And her response was, yeah, but they can't stop the war in Gaza because they're stuck. And then we talked about it for a little bit, and I realized, they're stuck. They can't just leave. Because leaving is admitting defeat. They've gone all in. They're stuck. They're literally getting ambushed left and right. They're not really holding anything. Like, they hold the above ground. They take a photo op, and then they get killed by an ambush. And it's like happening over and over again. They don't really control Gaza. Like, I'm sure the leadership has got to be thinking at some point, oh God, I don't know if we can actually military occupy this place. Like, it looks a lot harder than we thought it was going to be. But you can't leave because leaving is admitting defeat. So you just have to keep going. And the more you keep going, the more you're going to get fired on by Hezbollah. And then the only way that your settlers in the north are going to go back is if you take out Hezbollah. But you can't really do that when you're busy in Gaza and you're stuck in Gaza. Anyway, this is my ranty, not military analyst way of saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Israel seems militarily screwed right now. Am I wrong to say that? What are your thoughts?
I don't think you're wrong to say that. I mean, they've set themselves a totally impossible task. I mean, if you look at almost all the past sort of, Israeli military, incursions going back to the Second Intifada, the various wars that have happened in Gaza, there's always a lot of like very tough, very bellicose rhetoric. We're going to, do this, we're going to do that. But, they tend to set a range of expectations. It's basically like everyone knows Israel's going to go in there and they're going to deliver a lot of punishment. And then pretty much every time, even though they never, really achieved their goal of stopping the resistance. And in fact, the resistance in Palestine, if you look consecutively since the Second Intifada, has actually only gotten stronger. They just concoct this thing. Well, we've killed X number of people. We've destroyed X number of tunnels. We arrested X number of people. And that shows that like we're still the top dog. But they don't really have to win per se. They're able to just define their actions in such a way that appear that they did not lose, and that sometimes are interpreted as, oh, they won. Like they went in and they won the Battle of Jenin in 2002. Well, if they won, why are they in Jenin right now in the exact same way? Like obviously they did not. But this time, because of whatever reason, they set themselves a totally impossible goal of destroying Hamas. And so now they've launched this invasion on top of this genocidal bombing campaign in order to try to quote unquote destroy Hamas, which they cannot do. But since they have now set themselves up to do such, as you say, if they withdraw, it will be a political price that could lead to the collapse, not just of the Netanyahu government, but the entire Israeli project. And I think that might sound, grandiose to some people, but let's just be real here. Israel would not be the first country that had entered a war with basically unwinnable stakes in order to do various different things and collapse because of it. The Austro-Hungarian Empire Empire, the Ottoman Empire. We could list several others that completely collapsed because of what took place in a war. And I think that when you look at Israel, everything to them is about deterrence and the ability to quote unquote keep their own people safe. I mean, that is why the Iron Dome exists, right? Is to create this sort of fiction that the rockets that were being fired from Gaza couldn't really hurt anybody. Now, of course, we can see the Iron Dome can be overwhelmed and so on and so forth. But the point being here is that, they the inability to restore a sense of we can control these people means that those who go to Israel for quote unquote safety will no longer feel that it is quote unquote safe, and thus will either cease coming or leave in large numbers. And without this sort of constant increase of settlements, obviously the Israeli project cannot continue to exist, then, the overall thing will start to wither. And so I think that there are a lot of challenges to the Israeli military campaign that really all start with the fact that they've defined an impossible goal that they cannot achieve via military or political means. But because the population is so united behind this goal, to withdraw from Gaza would be such a defeat that I personally believe it would not only put Netanyahu in dire straits, I think the entire Israeli political class would be in a very serious set of turmoil. I think people in Israel would probably not accept that. I mean, you see very small numbers of them want a ceasefire, so they seem to want, this genocidal war to go on. And who knows what would happen. I mean, I listed those past empires that have collapsed because, that was not also preordained in the peace that ended World War I, but very rapidly ending after that peace, they all started to unravel. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, to some degree the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, because of the contradictions that had been unleashed by the end of the war. But yes, I think Vijay made this point very well. Despite 2 months of massive genocidal bombing that's destroyed, huge numbers of the buildings. I saw something, I think, from The Guardian, even more than the number of buildings destroyed in the firebombing of Dresden in World War II. The fact that they've killed, nearly 20,000 people in Palestine. The fact that they have brought huge amounts of blood and treasure and thousands of troops, and they can't even stop them from firing rockets. I mean, they're saying, well, we're doing all this, we've done all this to Hamas. Well, to continue to have all these different resistance factions, consistently fighting in sophisticated ways all across the Gaza Strip, in addition to launching rockets. And not just launching rockets, I mean, Hamas actually unveiled a new, more powerful rocket in the middle of this and started firing it at Israel. I mean, it really does say quite a bit about the so-called, vaunted Israeli war machine, that they have been totally unable to crush the resistance in Gaza, despite an unprecedented onslaught of violence funded by billions of dollars and backed by the United States and the most powerful countries that have all also been giving intelligence to Israel to help them wage the war. We've seen over and over again the Israeli intelligence fail again and again and again from October 7th on. So there are so many different things that have been revealed. And I think, to close here, this is why they said we had to destroy Hamas. I think it was a panic response to the fact that almost all of their sort of military prowess they'd put in the world had been revealed as not what they said it was, and they had to try to say something to see if they could reclaim the initiative. But now they put themselves in a cul-de-sac, and it seems that no matter what they are doing, they are unable to defeat the resistance. Things are only expanding. As you mentioned, Hezbollah, of course, Yemen, where things are happening, Iraq, where, I think at this point there's been over 100 attacks on U.S. bases. And America, by the way, is basically not responding. I mean, they're doing some responses to what's happening in Iraq, but they're terrified to respond in a huge way because, listen, they know that there's 1 million Iraqis in the Popular Mobilization Forces, and probably more Iraqis than that quite frankly would be more than happy to, kill all the Americans that are there in Iraq, if that is what it took to stop the slaughter in Gaza. They know that in Yemen, there are tens of millions of people who are willing to risk it all in order to try to help the people of Gaza, no matter what happens to them. I mean, you look at the context of what's happening in Lebanon, where, of course, there's a lot of different challenges, but I think the vast majority of people are generally, not looking for Israel to continue to expand this war, and also are willing to make significant sacrifices on behalf of the Palestinian people. So even the most powerful military on the planet Earth, the United States, is fearing a full-on response from the resistance axis, which will undoubtedly bleed over into Jordan. It'll bleed over into Egypt. It'll bleed over into countries that are not technically a part of it, where people also are very angry that, quite frankly, the military prowess of the Western machine machine, whether it be the U.S. or Israel, is very much in the dock here. I think there's a lot of questions people should be asking themselves about the trillions of dollars that have been spent with their tax dollars to build up these military machines that seem totally unable to defeat the Palestinian people, who are not as well armed, certainly, not as well funded, certainly, and are in a very limited geographic area that they're basically trapped in, and yet still they can't do but so much but to tighten the noose. So anyway, that's just a long way of saying, yes, I think that you are in fact correct. I think this is a military cul-de-sac for the Israelis. I think certainly they've set themselves a goal that they cannot achieve. And quite frankly, what I believe will happen is that they will indeed withdraw from the Gaza Strip, will be not only seen as one of the greatest military victories, period, from a military perspective, but from the point of view of the Middle East and of Israel, I think will be the biggest turning point since 1948.
Wow, that's a pretty big turning point. That's like a very.
Listen, I mean, the thing I'll add about that, Rania, just to say,
wiped off the map.
Yeah, the thing I'll add about that, because people say, "Oh, that's crazy." In the mid 1980s, the South African government seemed stronger than it ever had been before. They had this huge military working with Israel, by the way. They had, they've taken over Namibia. They've invaded Angola, and they've taken over like the bottom third of Angola. They have forced Mozambique to sign, a humiliating peace because they're funding Renamo that just was, the worst storms of terrorist attacks, destroying everything they possibly could destroy all across Mozambique, completely tanking their economy. They forced Zambia onto the back foot. They forced Zimbabwe onto the back foot. I mean, it seemed like apartheid South Africa was stronger than it ever been. They were waging massive violence against the townships on a regular basis. They had created the Bantustan governments that made it seem like they were going to have an internal settlement that could outflank the ANC, and that there are these new black leaders that were emerging that would change the course of the struggle. They brought in the tricameral parliament to bring in quote-unquote colored people, as they call them there, mixed race people and Indians and others, to try to expand the political base of the apartheid regime. So no one was saying in 1984, wow, South Africa is really like about to fall, and in 10 years, there'll be a black majority. No one was saying that. In fact, what people were saying is it looks like South Africa is winning. And even the Soviet Union, under the traitor Gorbachev, who threw the country away, was starting to warm up to South Africa because they thought there's no military solution in South Africa. There's no way that the guerrilla armies can win and succeed. And then 6 years later, Nelson Mandela was released, and 10 years later, the apartheid regime had completely collapsed. And I say that to say that the use of military power by these settler colonial regimes in this increasing way is a sign that their ideological political hegemony is slipping. And they have to use more and more violence to hold on to what they have, or they'll lose everything. And I think that's an important lesson about what's happening right now with Israel. Is it seems like they're so undefeatable and everyone is behind them. Everyone said the exact same thing about South Africa, and look what happened there. So I definitely think if the Israeli forces are forced to leave Gaza by the resistance of Palestinian people, I think that's a blow that it'll be very difficult for them to come back from, just like Cuito Carnevale in Angola was a very difficult victory for them to come back on and turn the tide against the apartheid regime in Namibia and subsequently South Africa.
Wow, I mean that is a lot to think about and to reflect on as we witness what's going on. I think it's very easy. Obviously, it's horrifying to watch. It's horrifying. People are paying with their lives in such extreme, crazy ways. Mm-hmm. But liberation is bloody. And it does cost a lot of lives. And based on what you just said, I think it is important for people to kind of come back and understand that even though Israel's massacring civilians, militarily, they haven't accomplished anything. They just are massacring civilians. Anyway, I think that's very well said, Eugene.
Thank you. Well, on that note, we will bring it to a close here today. Big thanks to all our guests, of course. Big thanks to all of our viewers. We got a special treat for you, holiday treat, next week here on the Freedom Side. I won't even reveal it to you because it's a holiday treat, so you have to wait for the gift to be unwrapped. But trust me, you will want to be here on Thursday of next week, the 21st, live at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's going to be good.
Well, I guess I'll have
Just
to
get
be
ready.
there.
Well, I hope you would be there, but nonetheless, it's going to be very good. So as all, the show's very good every week, but trust me, you want to watch next week, we got a special treat for you. But of course, you can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news, patreon.com/breakthrough news, become an ongoing patron with us. But for myself, for Rania, for our Breakthrough News team, very happy to see you this week, and we will see you next time.